Welcome to another ukulele tutorial. I'm Lara, and today I'm going to show you how to understand chord diagrams and how to read tablature. Chord diagrams represent the chord shapes that we play with our left hand as we strum the chords and sing through a song. Tablature, on the other hand, shows the notes that we're playing to fingerpick a melody. We'll start off by looking at chord diagrams, and I'll teach you 5 key tips to understand how to play these chords. We'll look at several different chord examples. After that, we'll move into tablature, and I'll share with you 5 key tips to reading tablature and fingerpicking a melody. We'll look at a song example of a famous song that you will likely recognize. Now let's get started with our chords. The first thing to understand is how your strings relate to the lines in the chord diagram. The vertical lines in any chord diagram represents from left to right strings 4, 3, 2, and 1. So from left to right, you can also think of it as G, C, E, A. Chord diagrams generally show 5 frets. So if we look at the squares at the top, the first row is the first fret, the second row is the second fret, and then we have the third, fourth, and 5th fret. The next thing to understand about chord diagrams is that an open circle indicates an open string, so there are no frets played on that string. A closed black circle indicates that that fret is played. The first chord that we'll look at is C6. Notice the open circles at the top of each string on the chord diagram. This means that every string is left open. We don't have any fingers of our left hand on any strings. This is the easiest chord to play. I want to point out that I'm playing a tenor with a low G. If you have a high G on your instrument, you can follow this entire tutorial. Just keep in mind that when we play our chords, they'll sound slightly different because your 4th string will be 1 octave higher than mine. Now let's take a look at our G chord. The 4th string is open. The 3rd string will play the 2nd fret. On the 2nd string, we'll play the 3rd fret, and on the 1st string, we'll play the 2nd fret. This is the most common fingering for G. However, some people, on certain occasions, may switch the index and middle fingers. Generally, for transitioning between G and other chords, this is the fingering you want to use, with your index finger on the 3rd string, ring finger on the 2nd string, and middle finger on the 1st string. The next piece to understand is that in general, you will create your own fingering for these chords. There are some occasions when you might see the fingerings on the chord diagram, and we'll take a look at this, but most often the fingerings are up to you. Now let's take a look at our E minor 7 chord. For this chord, we have open circles above our 4th string and 2nd string, so those 2 strings will be left open. We have closed circles on the 2nd fret of the 3rd string and the 1st string, so we will play those 2 frets. Notice that I'm playing this chord with my index finger and my middle finger. This is just one option. I could also play it with my middle finger and my ring finger. You can experiment with different chord fingerings, and you might have a preference based on how comfortable the different fingerings are, and also which chords you're transitioning from and transitioning to. As an example, I may want to use this fingering of middle and ring finger to play E minor 7 when I'm transitioning to A minor. On the other hand, I may want to use my index and middle fingers to play this chord when I'm transitioning to C. The nice thing about chords is that it's entirely up to you how you would like to play them. On rare occasions, you might actually see left-hand fingerings indicated on a chord. Here's an example. This is a G chord, and it's showing 2, 3, and 4, indicating our index finger as finger number 2, middle is number 3, and ring finger is number 4. So this diagram is showing us that our 2nd finger should be on the 3rd string, our 3rd finger should be on the 1st string, and our 4th finger should be on the 2nd string. The next tip is that if you see multiple circles across one fret, you can play them with one finger rather than playing them with multiple fingers across the various strings. This is called a bar chord. I'll put a link above to my short tutorial on bar chords. If you want to learn how to play them, I walk you through 5 essential tips to make them much easier to play. Let's take a look at an example of a bar chord. This is C minor. I'm playing the 3rd fret across strings 1, 2, and 3. I'm only using my index finger to play this chord. Another option for playing this chord is to use your index, middle, and ring fingers to play these 3 strings. You can try it both ways and see which one you prefer. The last piece to understanding chord diagrams is that for chords that are played higher up the neck, you might see a number on the diagram that indicates which fret to start on. Let's take a look at an example of a chord that's played higher up the neck. This is a D chord. Keep in mind that chords can be played multiple ways up and down the neck. You may have seen D as the 2nd fret across strings 2, 3, and 4. This is a different fingering for D, and it starts on the 5th fret. Looking at this chord diagram, you'll notice the number 5 and the letters FR to the right of what is usually our 1st fret. This is an indication that this chord actually starts on the 5th fret. There are 2 closed circles on strings 1 and 2, so I'm going to play these 2 with my index finger. Next, we're moving 1 fret up to go to string 3, which I'll play with my middle finger, and then 1 more fret up on the 4th string, which I'll play with my ring finger. The tip to keep in mind here is that if you see a number to the top right of the chord diagram, then that number is the fret that this chord starts on. If you're enjoying this tutorial, please give it a thumbs up, and thank you so much for subscribing. Now we're moving into tablature. Tablature is a form of musical notation that's different than sheet music, and it allows us to read all of the frets that are played for fingerstyle ukulele. When we read tablature, we'll be fingerpicking the notes, so it's important to have a bit of background on fingerpicking. If this is new to you, I'll put a link above to my tutorial on Fingerpicking 101, where I walk you through some of the essential fundamentals. The first step in reading tablature is understanding the correlation between your strings and the lines in the tablature. It's different than what we saw in the chord diagrams. Let's take a close look at this. Tablature is displayed with the strings in horizontal lines. There are 4 strings, so you can look at these as either A down to G or string 1 down to string 4. The next piece to understand is that the numbers that you see in the tablature represent which fret is intended to be played on each string. The numbers do not represent which fingers of your left hand play these notes. That's often a piece of confusion, so remember that the numbers represent the frets. As an example, we'll use the first line of the chorus from the song You've Lost That Lovin' Feeling. Notice the numbers above the bars that separate each measure. These indicate the numbers of the measure, and they don't impact how you play the song, but they're there for reference. For example, if you're playing in a group and you all want to start together partway through the song, then you can reference a certain measure to start on. Looking at the first measure, the number 3 is shown 3 times on the A string. This means that we should play the 3rd fret of the A string 3 times. Moving into the second measure, we have 5-0-5-0, still on our A string. This means that we play the 5th fret, followed by 0 is an open string, and the 5th fret again, and then another open string. In the third measure, we have a rest, and then 2-0-2. So we'll play the 2nd fret, open string, and then 2nd fret again. In the 4th measure, we're bringing in our 2nd string, or our E string. We're going to go back and forth between the 1st string and the 2nd string on the 3rd fret. here's what it looks like if I play through this entire line. Now remember that you get to decide which left-hand fingers you want to use to play the melody, and it's also up to you which of your right-hand fingers you would like to use to pick the strings. The next tip for understanding tablature is that you may play more than one note at the same time. Let's take a look at an example. Let's look at our sample line again, and you'll notice that I've added more numbers. Underneath our second note, there are now 3 zeros. Notice that they're all stacked on top of each other, and that means that they should all be played at the same time. There are 2 ways that we could play this. The first way to play this chord is to fingerpick all 4 strings at the same time. The second way is to play all 4 strings at once in a down strum. For the first measure, the 2 options would sound like this. Either or. If we look at the second measure, instead of playing only the 5th fret of our first string, we now have 3 5s listed as well as a 0. So this means that we're playing the 5th fret on strings 1 through 3, and the 4th string is open. Here's what this sounds like. So our 2 options for playing the second measure would sound like this. Either or. Our third measure has not changed. However, we do have some additional numbers at the beginning of our 4th measure. Instead of playing only the 3rd fret of the first string, we're also going to play the 3rd fret of the second string, and then we have 2 zeros for strings 3 and 4, indicating open strings. Here are the 2 options for playing this measure. The first is the second is here's a look at this entire line. The next tip is that sometimes tablature will also list the chords. Playing the chords is optional, and generally you'll want to play either the chords or the tablature. Sometimes you can play both at the same time, but this can be a bit confusing when people start learning tablature. So let's take a look at an example of this. Now here's another look at this line with the chords added in above the measures. You'll see C, F, G, and C. If you were to play this song by strumming the chords or fingerpicking the chords, you would use these chord changes as a guide. In general, you'll want to either follow the chords or follow the tablature. If you want to combine the chords and the fingerstyle melody, here's an example of what you could do on this line. You could play the C chord at the beginning of the first measure and the G chord at the beginning of the 3rd measure. Here's what this would sound like. The last tip is that arpeggios will have a squiggly arrow next to them. An arpeggio is when a chord is played out note by note, rather than played all at once. Let's take a look at this notation. Now we'll go back to our sample line where we had the additional notes. You'll notice now I've added squiggly arrows next to these notes. These indicate arpeggios. When we play an arpeggio, we want to hear the individual notes. So instead of playing them all together, we're going to play through it more slowly. Notice the direction of these arrows. They're pointing toward the A string. This means that these arpeggios are played like this. You may also see an arpeggio pointing in the opposite direction toward the G string. That would be played this way. It's much more common to play arpeggios in a downward motion toward the A string. Here's what this line sounds like, incorporating the 3 arpeggios. I hope this tutorial has helped you to better understand chord diagrams and how to read tablature. Now have fun with your ukulele, and thank you so much for watching.